So tonight, we have Joel Parriott from the American Astronomical Society. And, you know, we mostly have science talks, but we've had talks about instruments, about, you know, how people build astronomical instruments, both ground-based and space-based, satellites that have different kinds of observational capabilities. But a part of it that's really just as important is how we get the resources to do the astronomy. And Joel has worked on that for a long, long time. He got his PhD at the University of Michigan, and it is a PhD in astrophysics. He worked on supercomputer simulations of stellar mass loss in elliptical galaxies, in case that's your favorite thing to talk about. He went from there to the National Academies in Washington, where he worked on a number of projects, including the decadal survey, the study of astronomy that the astronomical community does once every 10 years to set priorities for the coming decade. So this advises the funding agencies. He went from there to the Office of Management and Budget, where he worked to represent the president's policies and budget desires to the Department of Energy Office of Science and the National Science Foundation. And since 2012, he's been at the American Astronomical Society, where he's the Director of Public Policy and the Deputy Executive Officer. And so he's talking tonight, and I have to tell you one more thing before I bring him out here. Science Policy in the Age of Trump and Beyond, Federal Priorities in Astronomy and Space Science. We have a Facebook page. And we put this on the Facebook page, and we wanted to highlight it. And Facebook said, no, you can't highlight it because it's going to be too political. And so I guess that's because we have the word beyond in there. But I'm sure Joel will take care of that. So let's welcome Joel Parriott.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I thought the Trump thing would be a draw. Wow. Yeah, if you turn it all up, I'll thank everybody that there's like 300 people in here because I won't be able to see. So thank you for that introduction and for the invitation. It's great to be here. Last time I was in Santa Barbara, every time I walk off the plane, I think, why does anyone ever leave here? So maybe I won't leave tomorrow morning. I don't know. I also felt really conspicuous walking up tonight because I have a suit on. And I don't think anybody else has one. So I'm not wearing a tie, which is, you know, really loosening up for somebody from the East Coast. So I'm from the American Astronomical Society, and we're the professional society for astronomy. It's sort of like the American Medical Association for doctors, American Dental Association for dentists. There's an association for everything. In fact, we belong to an association for associations. So, and I am the quote-unquote lobbyist for the AAS. I'm not a real lobbyist, but that's maybe why I had to wear a suit. I don't know. So tonight we're going to talk about setting priorities, about competing views of what the U.S. Should be doing or not doing in some cases. And that's a huge subject. It's extremely complicated. As I was preparing this talk, each slide I thought could be its own talk. So we're going to stick to just our little astronomy corner of it. So I'm advertising too here for your other ones and your past ones. There were a lot, so I couldn't get past Deborah Fisher, but you heard Gabby Gonzalez. So how many people, if you can raise your hands, have been to one of these previous science talks? Okay, a good number of you. So I'm going to cheat and assume that since you're interested in science, I can skip the part of the discussion where I have to motivate why science is an important thing for the U.S. to do and the government to do. Can I skip that? Excellent. That's going to save us a lot of time. But normally with these kind of talks, you do spend a lot of time motivating that. That's sort of one bookend. So it turns out everybody agrees with you. This is from the National Science Foundation, does every 2 years, they're mandated by Congress to do a study of, they call it science and engineering indicators. So there's a lot of surveys that go out, there's a lot of data collection that happens. This is just one piece of asking and surveying people on what they respond, how do they rate certain questions. So the one that I hope you all agree with at the bottom is agreeing that federal government should fund scientific research, and that does pretty well. What I find, just as a side, very interesting about this is the top one, that you're very interested in scientific discoveries, actually decreases when you get a college degree and then a higher level degree. You're less interested in new stuff, which maybe that makes sense. I don't know. So for somebody who has to represent the field, what a great product. You know, if I was in marketing, it's a wonderful product. And there I'm advertising for Astronomy on Tap in the bottom right. The top right is Times Square when the Mars Curiosity lander was landing. And there were scenes like this all over where people were gathering to watch this happen. And it was amazing if you were able to watch it. On the left, there's a ton of citizen science that goes on in our field. This is part of Zooniverse, it's called. This is just the space ones, and there's 19 different projects of people contributing to actual science. I don't know if Deborah Fisher may have even have mentioned Planet Hunter at the bottom right, where people are actually sorting through data and finding planets that either the researchers or the artificial intelligence they use didn't find. So people are willing to spend their time. For a long time, the SETI had been using people's home computers, you know, when they weren't using them. And I think that's still going on. So this is more survey data, this time just about space on the left, and what people think should be happening at NASA, that we think it's essential that the US be a world leader in space exploration. Most people agree with that. The space station, a good investment. Some disagreement, but most of the people think NASA should be continued to be involved, not just the private sector. On the right, there's a bunch of stuff up top about facts and differences between scientists' opinions and general public opinion, and the gaps between them. Those top three are facts. So let's move past those. But if you can see at the bottom four are more opinions and things that you think we should do. And you can see it's the one area where scientists and the general public generally agree that the space station is a good thing. And that's 2014 data. And if you look on the left, that's 2018. So this is both Pew Research that did both of these. So the space station went up 16 points between 2014 and 2018. So good for the space station. So how did we get here and have such good products that everyone's excited to hear and talk about? Part of it, and Todd alluded to this, is our community's long-standing method of setting priorities. It goes all the way back to 1964. So other than the fact that everybody on the right-hand side is a white man, which maybe made sense back then, but you can see that we've been doing this 6 times, and there's the covers on the bottom. And each one of these, and this is just for space I'm going to look at now. The first one was only ground-based, so that didn't have NASA involved. From then on, NASA's been involved. And this is one of the slides they like to use to show the heritage of the decadal surveys compared to big space missions. So the 72 study is where Hubble Space Telescope came out of. The next one was the 1982, where Chandra X-ray mission came out of. Spitzer infrared. We're still waiting on James Webb Space Telescope to launch. And that came out of the 2001 survey. That's the one that I worked on when I first came to DC. And then the most recent one, the 2010, which recommended WFIRST, and I'm sure David Spergel will probably talk about that when he's here. And the next one coming up, which is supposed to start up this fall. So the whole community is sort of getting ready for the next decadal survey. It's a big deal. A large fraction of the community, several hundred people ultimately get involved in it. So let's go a little bit further back, and this will lead up to something nice for LCO. So astronomy is weird, right? That there's this long heritage of patronage and private support. So I just decided that I could have gone earlier than this, but I just decided to start with the Medici family and their relationship with Galileo. We'll come way back, much into this. Well, I don't know when all these were founded. That's a good question. These are all California ones. So we have Carnegie, Palomar, and Lick, private funded. And there you go, Todd. Most recent announcement, right? A gob of money for 2 new telescopes from the Moore Foundation. So this is totally unusual for science, and within Washington, we have to explain this when we talk about ground-based astronomy over and over again, that there's this weird mix of private and public, and getting everybody to work together is difficult, but it's a feature and a bug. But we hope it's more a feature than a bug. So that's the sort of private side of astronomy and the long heritage for it. The public side, the federal support started pretty soon after World War II. On the left, you have Vannevar Bush, who was FDR's, they didn't really have a science advisor, but he was sort of FDR's and then Truman's science advisor. He wrote a report called Science, the Endless Frontier, which basically made the case after World War II that we should greatly expand the amount of money that we spend on research and development beyond just military means. He's the person in that report behind the creation of the National Science Foundation, for example. NASA followed pretty quickly thereon. From there, we pretty soon move into the Cold War. So I don't know, is that a weird picture? I don't know. So here's the long history of federal support. On the top, that's total research and development as a percentage of our gross domestic product, so everything that we produce. And you can see below that is the federal government, and that big bump on the left is largely the Apollo program. So the federal government back then spent a huge fraction of the federal budget and of just the national economy for its size on the Apollo program, but that's been steadily decreasing since then. The blue dotted line is the contributions from the business sector, and they crossed over. So the majority of research and development in the country right now, and for some time has been funded by the private sector. That's almost all development. It's not basic sort of discovery research like astronomy, almost all development. And then on the bottom is everything else. Private foundations, states, that sort of thing. So that would be where like LCO funding is. So we soon moved out of the Cold War after the wall came down into a new reason to fund more research, economic competitiveness. And a report came out in the George W. Bush administration, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, basically saying we're standing pat while the rest of the world is catching up. The US is dominant, and that's the top line. This is research spending in billions of dollars. And you can see China, or should I say, if this is a Trump talk, I should say China or something like that. The violet line, so rapidly catching up. And that was the theme of that report, was the US is great, we're dominant, but the rest of the world figured out that this is a really good thing to invest in, and they're catching up. And if we don't do something about it, they're going to surpass us. So that was compelling to the Bush White House. And the president approved a big initiative that was meant to double the NSF budget, double the Department of Energy Office of Science budget, double the budget of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Congress loved it. They passed the America Competes Act. Everybody was on board, bipartisan, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And that was going well. Obama folks, when they came in, were interested in the idea, but the problem was the Great Recession hit. So all that planning, all that enthusiasm was quickly gone. The Obama administration said as one of the answers, if you remember, the stimulus. So they tried to push through and were successful in a mostly partisan way, an $800 billion package to stimulate the economy. Science is captured in that infrastructure and science piece, roughly $30-ish billion to science, which was a ton of money. But soon after that, politically, it was such a disaster, and this is sort of where real restraint came in. President Obama basically acknowledged that the deficit and deficit spending is not a great idea. So the second that he did that, and everyone started talking about debt. And so this is a plot of the percentage of, again, gross domestic product of federal debt. You can see the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and these are CBO, Congressional Budget Office projections going up, up, and up. So these are the sorts of pictures. Here's another one comparing long-term forecast of FY 2018, spending versus revenues. The delta there is roughly $1 trillion. And that only gets worse in their projections going out. So these are the sorts of things in Washington where they start hammering, say, we need to spend less, need to spend less. They put up statistics like this. This one kind of is depressing, where these are, at least according to the Congressional Budget Office, what you would have to do if you wanted to get rid of the deficit and debt, and different scenarios. So you would have to have annual cuts in spending of 15%, or 17% increases in revenues, just to sort of stand pat. So these are the things that scare everybody. And it's hard politically in DC to push back against these things, especially when President Obama was saying it's a real issue. So they created something called a super committee that was going to fix everything, deal with all the hard problems, and that failed because they couldn't reach agreement. So something called the sequester hit. You don't need to worry about the weird percentages. This is from the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, has a big R&D analysis shop. And these are a bunch of different scenarios. All you need to know, this is non-defense discretionary. This is the only part that people seem to want to touch. It's been going since then down and down and down. The red dashed line was in the most recent president's request, showing where they wanted this to go in the out years. This continued to decrease non-defense, so that's non-military, non-VA, domestic discretionary spending. The problem from a science standpoint, forgetting all the other things that are going to get cut if we're just going to focus on science, is that empirically, roughly 10 to 13% of discretionary spending goes to R&D. So if we keep going down and down and down, less is going to get spent on research. So how much, is getting spent on research? We're going to look at the big pie chart. It wouldn't be a Washington budget talk without pie charts. So you can see here a $4.4 trillion proposed budget. The revenue side, which isn't presented in this diagram, is about 3.4. So this includes baked in $1 trillion in deficit in FY19, even in the Trump budget. So I have a good friend who has a great quote about this. So if you look at all the gray, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, lots of other mandatory spending, my federal pension retirement's in there somewhere, very small piece. lots of other mandatory programs, the net interest that we pay on the national debt. The defense area, red, defense R&D, that little pullout. Blue, all that non-defense that we were just talking about that they want to cut, and then the little R&D slice of that. So my friend had a quote, you have to think about the federal government as an insurance company, it's all the gray, with an army, the red. And that accounts for most of the government. So this is a thing people talk about a lot, that there was this study, then everyone thought how great NASA is, that it must comprise a quarter of that slice, which NASA's buried down in that non-defense R&D piece. It's about $20 billion of that. So this is the other thing people point to when they want to cut entitlement spending, that gray stuff in that pie chart, that this is as a percentage of the federal budget, the growing green squeezing out everything else, defense and non-defense. And the stuff we care about is way at the bottom. Non-defense, discretionary, civilian R&D. So the argument is, well, green is just going to continue to grow unless we do something, and all of a sudden it'll be 100% of the federal budget, and there'll be no room for anything else. So because that's going to happen, we need to cut the smallest pieces at the very bottom. So just so you don't think that this is a partisan affair, this is a chart of R&D spending broken out into non-defense and defense. Defense blue, non-defense red, going all the way back to 49, and then charted by whether it was a Democrat or Republican in the White House. In a normal Republican administration, they love basic research. They don't believe in market interventions. They don't believe in picking winners or losers, so they want to fund basic research. Democrats believe in market intervention, so they want to fund more applied research and development. And that's been the model for a long time. You can see in the Obama years, non-defense R&D didn't do well. It did fairly well, actually, in the Bush administration. So you can never predict based on who's in the White House, just on party, how research and development is going to fare. And in fact, this is a summary from AAAS again of how various science and technology programs in the government fared during the Obama administration. That big blip in 2009 is that stimulus package. But beyond that, you can see a lot of the agencies spent a lot of time in negative territory, some ending totally in negative territory for the entire Obama administration. You can read a lot more about this. Science did not a very long article of science in the Oval Office and seeing how each different president, I think they go back to Truman, maybe just Eisenhower, and how R&D fared, how big things that happened or didn't happen, like in the Bush administration, the Kyoto Protocol being exited, that sort of thing, and how funding fared. So we've managed, I said Trump before, but yesterday I was talking at LCO and I managed 15 minutes into the talk before I mentioned the president. And now I made it 26 minutes into the talk, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. So we're through the end of Obama. Things didn't go that well because he had agreed that the deficit was a problem. Republicans controlled Congress after 2010, and we had a hard time keeping discretionary spending up. How did things go? A lot of people, and I'm not a political scientist, attributed the election to an anti-elitist, anti-managerial class election. whatever the reason, one of the things that I've found with the administration is there's no interest in hearing from experts, right? But if you get elected that way, and if that's what if that's what the electorate said to you, yes, we don't like the elites, then why would you listen to elites? So this is some of the headlines that came out soon after they started getting a hold of budgets and eliminating science advisory committees, which Todd's been on a lot of those, and he can probably say a lot of them probably weren't worth that much of his time, but so people get upset when they get eliminated, even if they're not doing that much. So something totally bizarre happened, is that scientists actually tried to do something about it. Normally, oh, that's dirty stuff, that advocacy, we don't want to get involved in that. But this March for Science was remarkable. I was in Washington for it. So this was the attempt at sort of pushing back. It got labeled immediately by Republicans as being a partisan affair, even though there's nothing on their website about that. It's all about evidence-based solutions. So this has already been tainted as being a Democrat issue. It's still around, the March for Science people. They're still doing annual marches. I don't know if they've done one around here recently or not. So that didn't really convince the administration to do anything different. There are budgets that came out, and here are more headlines, cut, cut, cut. The thing is, I'm picking science headlines, but there could have been similar headlines from this, from anything that got cut. So if you weren't the Defense Department largely, your program was getting cut. You know, programs for kids, health programs, whatever. So they weren't really targeting science, it was just like everything else got cut. This is a Washington Post summary of I think this is the 19 budget on how these various departments and programs fared. And you can see everybody gets cut except at the bottom, taking care of priorities. So this is what, when people win elections, they love to say this, and President Obama said it too after he was reelected, elections have consequences. So this is the consequence of people who have different priorities than the previous administration. Here's another summary, this one from Nature, on how a smaller subset of more research and development agencies fared in the 19 budget. NASA goes up a little bit, National Science Foundation flat, NIH got a little bump. Now, right before this one came out, there was going to be a budget that cut NIH by 30%. They cut NSF by 30%. And all of a sudden, Congress made a deal with the White House, signed a bill to add more money. And over the weekend, the White House called all those agencies and said, you know that budget you've been working on for 5 months where we cut you 30%? Yeah, forget that. Now, here's your new number. And they had to rewrite their budgets immediately over the weekend to account for this. But some of them still got cut. EPA, NOAA in the Commerce Department, U.S. Geological Survey. But the NASA one's interesting, and that's relevant for what we're talking about. Why is NASA, of all the things, spared, and in fact goes up a little bit in the midst of all these cuts? Well, it's the Space Council, the National Space Council. For whatever reason, Vice President Pence has been appointed to run that. The president and the vice president are very supportive of space work. That's Buzz Aldrin watching the president sign the executive order to begin the National Space Council. They had a really, grandiose is maybe an understatement, first meeting of the Space Council down at the Kennedy Space Center. Huge hangar with big equipment all around them, trying to have a meeting. The members of the National Space Council are like the secretaries of all the various departments. The bottom picture is the most recent National Space Council meeting, which was in the White House itself. And that's the president handing the pen. He signed an executive order on to the new administrator of NASA. So it's got a lot of traction in the White House, more than any other area of research by far. More look at how budgets are faring, mostly the same story. And the quote on the right is from the head, if I still worked at OMB, this would be my boss, Mick Mulvaney. After they signed a budget deal and all this money was supposed to come, the administration still couldn't bring themselves to spend all of it. Still couldn't do it. And this was the quote that he had in the letter he sent to the Hill, that we're still not going to put all that in because we just fundamentally disagree with spending all that money on non-defense discretionary. So one of the other things that happened in that budget that's bad for astrophysics, and David Spergel might talk about this, is the #1 space project out of that last decadal survey called WFIRST was canceled in that budget. So we talked all about our community having priorities and thinking long and hard and making tough choices and ranking things, and the #1 project got terminated in that budget. So that's where we were on the administration side until Congress weighed in. And I picked a nice godlight picture of the Capitol. I was saying yesterday that I've never seen godlight come down on the rotunda like that, so this has got to be photoshopped. But anyway, the theme here for this piece is the Constitution works. Separation of powers. The power in this case, and I'm quoting, these are both from the appropriations committees in the Senate and the House, from the front of their webpage. And they make it very clear, we're in charge of the money. Quoting from the Constitution. So they're very, very clear about that, and that's working for us. This is from the 113th Congress, which was in the 2013-14 time scale, but it really hasn't changed. Largely talking about who makes up Congress. What are their backgrounds? And you see most of them are lawyers. A lot of people from the private entrepreneurial world, government employees in the House. And somewhere on there, I think it's the gray on the right for the House, is an other category. And there's one physicist. Now, there are some medical doctors and such, but there aren't that many people in Congress who fundamentally understand what scientists do, what the needs are, what the rationale is, what the benefit to the country or their district or their state is. So that's just not their background. They're smart people, but they just don't have that experience base. There are a couple exceptions, both Republicans, and these two gentlemen are some of the leaders in Congress protecting research and development. On the left is Mr. Culberson from Texas. He loves the moon Europa, Jupiter moon Europa. He's showing, probably has an app on his phone, for watching the sky. He's an amateur astronomer. And he wants to find life on Europa because he views, and I probably tend to agree with him, that if that happens, demonstrable life on Europa, that fundamentally changes humanity. And that, in his view, money then pours forth and NASA can go above and beyond anything else. So he's very supportive. He's a real NASA guy, particularly planetary science. On the bottom right is Lamar Alexander. Unless anybody in here is from Tennessee, you may remember him. He would have been, I think, the Secretary of Education back in the H.W. Bush administration. But he gets it too. And this is a quote from him, and it could have been written by somebody like me. And this is somebody who knows and feels in his bones that this is an important investment. Again, both Republicans. So these are the headlines that came out after the Congress started marking up bills. saying, no thank you, ignores, yawns, short changes. So they're very serious about the separation of powers, and they get to decide how much money gets spent. So I was showing you all those cut pictures before. Now we're going to look at some plus pictures, because we're talking about what Congress did. This doesn't include the most recent markups that the House and Senate have done for appropriations for the FY19. That starts October 1 this fall through the end of next September. So these numbers would be even better if we put up their most recent numbers. The orange in this chart is the administration request, and the two blues are House or Senate marks. You see, with rare exception, and there are some, where the House would have agreed with the White House, sort of. We don't want to cut that much, but we'll cut a little bit. And the Senate completely ignored those. So Congress is doing the opposite. This is closer to home. We have, again, in the gray area, all the administration requests, and these are NASA programs, astrophysics, planetary science, National Science Foundation. So one of the really schizophrenic things, if you're running one of these programs at the White House or in one of the agencies, is you simultaneously have to keep in your head that your boss, let's take WFIRST. So the big astronomy thing that we want to build for the next decade, they killed that. So your boss says that's terminated. You know Congress is going to put it back, and they did in both of those bills. So depending on what audience you're talking to, you have to simultaneously plan for killing something and going on with it, for dramatic cuts on one hand, and what you know are going to be increases on the other. So it's completely inefficient. You have to keep, in this case, you do keep multiple sets of books, because you don't really know where you're going to end up. So this looks like it will probably continue. It's happened 2 fiscal years in a row. I just took a picture of a roller coaster off the web to say, like, this is, you know, I wouldn't want to be a program manager having to sort all that out. So there's a bit of hope, and this is very recent news. The president has just nominated somebody who's totally qualified, really smart, thoughtful, friendly, nice guy, to be the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, you know, informally known as the President's Science Advisor. He believes in human-induced climate change. He's a meteorologist. He's actually the first non-physicist, so the physicist time is done. The first non-physicist to be the President's Science Advisor. So this is from The Atlantic. I think they were being really hopeful. They used kind of the hope change graphic from the Obama years, that maybe Kelvin is going to bring something very different to the White House, and it will be done with the roller coaster. Now, there are a lot of people who think that he may just be set up to be the fall guy when they want to do bad things. Go talk to him. And that's possible. We saw a little bit of that in the Bush administration with Jack Marburger. Got sent out in front of the press every time something got cut, or there was an advisory committee eliminated or something like that. But, you know, Kelvin is, you know, he wears cowboy boots. He's from Oklahoma. He knows all of them. He's a good friend of the NASA administrator. So a lot of us in DC who know Kelvin well and think really highly of him have a lot of hope that he will at least try and do a little bit to change the trajectory that they're on. So I wanted to end with a hopeful note. Is everyone feeling hopeful? I can't really see. Yes? Okay, thank you. If anybody wants to talk about any of those or ask any questions, I'm happy to take questions or answer any of the charts or I can't really, there, yeah.
What was Airbnb on there on the side?
Well, that's showing you my cookies. I think I'm going to the International Astronomical Union meeting in Vienna in a couple weeks, and I think I'm doing an Airbnb there. So thanks to Google. That's just a screenshot. So you're seeing my ads. Yeah, Todd?
So going back to your, going back to your diagram where all of the mandatory stuff is growing without bound, I mean, it really looks like there's no hope. It really looks like yeah, so for instance, right, it's kind of crazy to talk about cutting everything below the red part in order to solve the problem. What are there radical alternatives?
Well, you know, this is what that super committee, so-called bipartisan super committee that Obama appointed was supposed to do. What they were trying to do is the two dash lines there are if the super committee had succeeded, the discretionary, non-defense discretionary would have been on that top dotted line. If they didn't, we were gonna end up on the quote-unquote sequester line, the dotted line below that. And the difference between those two over 10 years was $1.5 trillion. And if they could have come up with a way in entitlement reform, combination of cutting things that Democrats prioritize, cutting things that Republicans prioritize, God forbid, tax increases, things like that to fill 1.5 trillion, we would have been on that top line. Now you can see Congress has actually done better in the most recent budget deal than we were, even if the super committee had succeeded. But you're talking about entitlement reform, you know, and that's a touchy political subject. You know, we don't, as a professional society, a lot of people, if you go in and say, we want to spend more on our R&D, somebody will say, what are you going to cut? And can't we reform entitlements? And we just say, that's, you know, that's why you get paid the big bucks, Mr. Senator or Mrs. Congressperson. You know, we don't get into that. But it's entitlement reform is the only way, or taxes increases to address that.
So it's only taxes, what about defense also?
Yeah, the blue, you want to get at the blue? Yeah, we could do that.
Let's raise taxes.
Raise taxes or cut the Defense Department, those are two that I'm sure the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would be excited about. But again, it's choices and elections, you know, matter. Elections have consequences.
So you showed us how different the president's budget and the Congress budget was for science, for this administration. Has it always been that I mean, is this true for other administrations and other non-science topics as well, that they're that different? Does the president's budget always not meant anything?
Well, so the president's budget is a message. It's a statement of priorities. And when I worked at the White House Budget Office, you know, for my little piece of the government I was in charge of, I would go up to the Hill and say, what are your priorities? Because it's a waste of my time for the president's budget for my little piece to be completely non-starter with you. And so I would negotiate out with staff over there to make sure that a lot of it actually happened. But when you're just messaging, and it's all about messaging, then you don't really care. And so what if the program managers at the agencies have to carry these huge disparities in their head and be really inefficient in how you spend the money? A lot of times, and this happened just this year, agencies didn't get their final budget appropriations for this fiscal year, which ends September 30th, until a week or two ago. So they have to push out the entire agency budget in a short period of time, you're going to make bad, inefficient decisions. You're going to waste taxpayer money doing that. So I've seen it in previous, when you have Republicans running everything, it still sometimes gets messed up. Not as bad as this administration. They're not like a normal Republican administration. Democrats, you're always going to have differences in priorities on messaging. The worst is normally when two different parties control the Congress or the White House. But here's a case where Republicans are in charge of everything, okay? And you're dramatically different. So there's no way to really predict other than that it will continue to be inefficient.
Hello. It feels like most astronomers I know are spending a lot more time trying to raise private money, either foundations or talking to potential donors and so on. And I guess this tracks the concentration of wealth has been increasing in the U.S. But then, then the public is not making any of those choices. Then it just comes down to the personalities of the rich people or whatever. I don't know. Do you have any statistics on that or any comment on that?
So there's been a lot of, especially with these, what are they called, like the Chan-Zuckerberg initiative and what the Gateses are doing. And, in Washington, when those people come, and this is just what I see, and most of it's on the biomedical side, there's a lot of worry and tough questions from the research community about what they might be doing. Now, their view on the foundation side is like the National Institutes of Health has gotten too conservative and only funding stuff that's basically already been done and then you get your money. So they want to do stuff that's, riskier. So maybe there is room for both, but I think there is a question, certainly more in the biomedical area, but also into the physical sciences of, is this the right way to make choices? Now we're lucky in astronomy, by and large, that we have a clear priority list. So anybody who wants to give a bunch of private money can go look at that and say, I know that this is consistent, it's something I want to do and it's consistent with what the community says is important. So I think we're lucky in astronomy that way. But I've been at a couple conferences where people have argued, foundations versus federal agencies, but I think it's still not worked out, but it's a serious problem, I think. Good point.
I've heard that we're spending more on the military than all the rest of the world combined. Yeah. And our Secret Service budget's a secret. That we have a huge Secret Service budget.
Well, it's all buried in that red wedge. There's nothing that's, everything's in there. They just don't give you the details. So, politically cutting the military or Secret Service or something like that is...
The Secret Service may be in the non-defense discretionary budget. We don't know where it is.
Well, that's actually now in DHS, so that would be in the blue. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Department of Homeland Security is in the blue.
Well, could be another mandatory or something.
Hi, could you speak to Trump's Twitter patient with a Space Force, and what does that mean for NASA?
Thanks to Sandy, she said people were interested in the Space Force, so I actually...
Does that represent a threat, a cannibalization or malice toward NASA's science mission?
I don't think so. I think the bigger people who, Here, I've got a Space Force thing in here. So if you look in that the top pane, you'll see that the people who are least excited about this is the Air Force, because they view it as a direct usurpation of their existing authorities and money, and they think it's all going to come out of their hide. Lots of disagreement in Washington about this. The Pentagon has to sort of salute when the president says go do this, but they can drag their feet. People talked about the administrative state, the deep state. It does exist. I mean, I used to be part of it. At some level, you have to at least try to do something. It's a new branch of the military. And there's a lot of people in Congress who like it. There's a lot of people in Congress who don't like it. The Pentagon itself usually doesn't like it. So apparently this one on the bottom left is just from today. Pence is supposed to unveil a plan tomorrow on how all this will work, so we'll learn more tomorrow. But don't expect Congress to be really enthusiastic and fund it all.